Let's talk a little bit about your newest project, and then we want to just kind of go over some of the good old days with you and some of the things that you kind of helped accomplish behind the scene and where you got your desire to build this stuff for. You've been making a great product for a long time. Just give us a little insight on your newest project here, though.
Well, is this thing working?
Yes, it's working.
Okay. I can't hear myself. This is a K37, and it's a narrow gauge Mikado. It's the biggest one that they had, the Rio Grande, and we're doing these in the K36 as well. These are pretty much state-of-the-art locomotives. I really like SN3. When I lived in New Mexico, of course, I lived in Chama. And the real things ran there in my backyard. I started out as an SP collector, but because of the fact that these things ran in my backyard and they were real, I could go down and touch them and feel them and smell them, feel the atmosphere, everything was there. I got hooked on narrow gauge, so that's why it's what we do.
Yeah, and that's where your passion comes from for them a lot. You guys really have been innovative in a lot of the features that you brought out through the years. Talk about some of those things that you guys kind of were first, and like you say, you're only first once, and then, every model almost kind of benefits when you come up with a new idea. So talk a little bit about some of the stuff you guys have worked hard on through the years.
Well, I started out a long time ago. Sorry, Jim. I started, like Chuck said, I started out as a child. But anyway.
You did?
Yeah.
Me too.
but when I first started messing around with these trains, the modelers, most of the models looked nice, as they've improved over the years, like Jimmy said. But the early models didn't run all that well. They were noisy, and generally they didn't run very well. And so I was really into operation. I wanted things that ran well. And a long time ago, I lived in Jefferson City, Missouri. And I met a guy named Bob Rands, Railcraft now. Bob was one of the first guys, I guess, that ever came across micromotors. Mm-hmm. And these were the Fallhaber things. And we talked together, and he said, you need to take a couple of these things. Bill, you're into drives and making things work. He says, why don't you take a couple of these motors and see what you can do with them? So he gave me a couple of these motors, and they were like 22 millimeters, I believe, in diameter, something like that, maybe 30 millimeters long. And the first thing I put one in, believe it or not, was a SP number 8, a narrow gauge HON3 thing. I put it in the tender, and that little engine would just crawl along. We built the John Armstrong switching layout and took it to the NMRA convention, probably in '69. And I was sold on those motors, but what really got me sold on them was when PFM came out with their sound system. I was really into the sound. I wanted to hear my locomotive sound like the real thing. Bob Longnecker and I met in St. Louis in '70. And so I got some of the sound system, very first ones, and we tried it out, and they made electrical noise terribly. You could hear it. Those old open frame motors would buzz, that kind of a noise.
And you didn't hear that on the real thing, right?
No, it wasn't there at all. So what I did was I tried these micromotors, and they worked great. They didn't have the electrical noise, but they had an issue, and that was the headlights wouldn't work because he used a diode pack in there. The micromotor doesn't draw enough current to make the diodes work. It'll run through the voltage that goes across them, and so you didn't have any headlights. So Bob and I collaborated on a phone for a while and come up with the idea. We had to have some sort of resistance in there, and it was like firebox lighting, and that was the reason for the firebox lighting.
Really?
Yeah.
So you added detail while solving a problem.
Yeah. So that's how that all came about. And then we also in the early days, with those micromotors, I used to do custom work before I ever got into the import stuff, and I once again making these things run well. The micromotor was a perfect answer. I never used the gear drive ones because they were noisy in themselves, but the micromotor would fit in like an SP280 in HO. So I built a few things like that. And Katsumi had a great gearbox. It was a 27-to-1 gearbox, and it was quiet. It was a nice die-cast gearbox, worked well, but it was a 27-to-1. So with a standard motor that runs like 16,000 RPM, all the engines ran too fast. But that micromotor ran 8,200 RPM, was perfect. And there was a guy named Leighton Snover, right? Leighton Snover had come up with he got some of these great little universals. They were a metal universal joint. It was a kind of a thing like that. And they came out of Canon cameras. So I figured out that I could use that micromotor with a gearbox from the KTM with the Canon camera drive on it. Models were silent. They ran perfect, and that's what I was really after. So an interesting thing, byproduct of that was our first locomotive was a K37 in SN3. More stories, but I'll run out of time. But anyway, this 37 it had a 27-to-1 gearbox in it, and it had a Canon motor, and it probably went 14,000 RPM. You couldn't throttle it down. So I had once again a big motor. It was a coreless motor. We call it a rat motor because Chevrolet had rat motors. You know about that car stuff. Mouse motor, rat motor. Anyway, I put this big motor in this thing, and I built Chama. Some of you guys remember Chama, the layout.
The layout.
And they hold it around for 20 years. But anyway.
But now it's in a museum, right?
It's in a museum.
Oh, right, that's cool.
Yeah, but anyway, I built Chama, and there was a PCR, I think. It might have been a PCR. Was it, Fred, up in San Mateo or something? And Kehoe came. Kehoe Sung, he was the pusher for Sam Hogsett. And I had this 37 ran really perfect. It just crawled along, ran through Chama. It was a tough layout. It was all hand-laid stuff. Anyway, it was a great thing to display. But Kehoe saw this thing, and I said, Kehoe, this is the way models are supposed to run. He said, do you mean like this is the way?
And what did he say?
That's what he said.
Yeah.
Do you mean? This is how it should run? Yeah, that's how it's supposed to run. Oh, well, after that, we got the right gearing in these things, and they ran right. And, of course, everybody else's models benefited from that because these guys actually saw what this stuff was we expected out of them, right?
Yeah, and I think it's cool that you had to kind of be innovative with stuff. It's not like they were building this stuff for brass model trains. Like you said, it was a Canon drive piece, and then those motors, what were those originally meant for, those little micromotors?
The micromotor was an interesting thing in itself. Those motors were meant for the way they measure wind. It's called, I think, manometers. I might be wrong on the term. But anyway, the micromotor is so precise that if you connect one to another, you can turn the shaft on one, it'll turn the other. Really? Very, very, very nearly the same speed. And they had little silver commutators and gold brushes.
Right.
They're expensive things back in the day even. They were like $40 when in 1969, and were not cheap. Right. But they certainly were precision.
So you had to constantly be looking at things you could use in these models to make the models better to reach the level that you wanted to reach.
Yeah, I wanted them to run right, and I wanted them to have sound.
Right.
And of course, when Jimmy came along.
Yeah, how'd you guys meet? What's the connection here? Because we know Jimmy is Glacier Park, and we know you as PBL, but what happened here?
Well, Jimmy could. I think he already told you some stories about me. But anyway, when he first came, he was just a kid. Yeah. I mean, a kid, and he wanted to buy this Camtron C16 kit. And I said, you don't want that thing. Well, they were pretty awful. Anyway, but he decided that's what he really wanted. And then so some years later, he came to visit us. And was that when we had Huey and Betcha and bit you in the leg. We had
Oh yeah, I had a goose and it bit me in the leg.
Well, the goose was a Canadian goose that we picked up on the highway when we were coming home from a train show out on the West Coast.
It was hitchhiking? You picked it up?
Yeah. Well, it was about this big when we got it. But anyway, he bit Jimmy. But
Good.
but anyhow, Jimmy came in '84. By that time, there was a train convention. It was in
National Narrow Gauge Convention in Denver.
Yeah, he stopped through, and I didn't really know the guy, but he was building his stock car on the road. He was building this stock car from scratch. It was a 5900 stock, was it?
Yeah.
And he's going to paint it. And he says, I'm going to paint it in the motel room. And this kid's really got some huevos, So I thought, well, you can use my paint booth. I'll let you do that, And so we hit it up, and my bedroom was adjacent to my workshop in the house, a big old house in Chama. And so all night long he was working on this car, and then the next day at the show up there, he took first, top. What was it?
First place.
Yeah. First place with this thing that he'd built on the road.
Yeah.
And he was really impressive. And so when prior to that, on the day before, I told him, well, I'm not going to drag Shama up to Denver because it's a big deal. These pieces weigh like 150, 200 pounds a piece. And I'm getting old at that time, and I'm really old now. But Jimmy kept prodding me. He said, come on, Bill, you got to take this thing up there. And I said, I don't want to take it up there. And he said, I'll help you. So, okay, so we took it up there. It was an interesting show. It was in a basement, remember, in Denver. You remember that one, Fred? Gosh, it was awful, huh? And Malcolm Furlow was there, you remember? with his dancing girls and stuff. Anyhow, we had some fun there. And afterwards, told Jimmy, I said, I could use a man like you. Maybe sometime you ought to come out here and give it a try.
And so I did. I went out to work for Bill for a few weeks, and we hit it off. We had a lot of fun, and of course I wanted to live in Chama. Any place would be better than Iowa. No, but but we had a good time, and we've got a lot of stories to tell. But one story I want to tell about the drivetrains was one time we had a problem with the gearbox, and this is how thorough we try to do things, is we could tell that the gearbox was making a lot of noise, the gears were rattling around inside, but we could not get Sam Hunks to fix it the way we wanted to. And pictures are worth 1,000 words, but a video might be worth 1,000,000, and so we actually machined a window inside the gearbox. You remember that, Mr. Herr? We machined a window on the side of the gearbox so they could see the gears oscillate inside the gearbox and send them a videotape, and they were able to correct the problem. And so, now we got a tight precision gearbox, and that was a gearbox design that Sam Honks used to the end of time, and now Seho's using that same design on all the models. And so we can really attribute that all that effort Bill did in the past, that we got really great running models.
All right. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for joining us.
Sure.